For many of us who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, Harry Potter was the stuff of our childhood dreams. I can remember my 13-year-old self absolutely enchanted when I saw the Wizarding World come to life from the books my grandmother gifted me when I was a kid. The Great Hall, Gryffindor Common Room, the library, seeing them all come to life on the big screen was like getting a Hogwarts letter in my own mailbox, and believe me when I say I wasn't the only one, because the movie grossed nearly $1 billion worldwide, easily becoming the second highest grossing film of all time at the time. This was, for those of you who were born in the 2000s, the MCU of the day. There was nothing bigger, which is why Hogwarts has always held a special place in my heart since I was a kid, and why I'm really excited to finally bring it to the next installment of an Architect Reviews, a series in which I employ my professional expertise to examine something in the digital realm. To be clear here today though, we're looking at the Hogwarts of Hogwarts Legacy and not the ones of the film because they do differ. As always, by the end, if you feel I did a good job and deserve it, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button to show your support. It would mean the world to me. This video was quite a challenge to compose, as you might imagine. However, before we go any further, I feel it's important to first address the controversy surrounding Hogwarts Legacy and the franchise as a whole, as I feel saying nothing at all could be misconstrued as a statement as much as saying something, and I'd rather my views on the subject be clear rather than guessed at or misunderstood. I don't share nor do I condone the statements or views of J.K. Rowling. Transgender women are women, full stop, and to say otherwise diminishes the identity and attacks the dignity of transgender people. As the actor who played Harry Potter said himself, Daniel Radcliffe, it goes against all the advice given by professional healthcare associations to make statements to the contrary. Like Daniel, I believe that we need to do more to support transgender and non-binary people. Having transgender friends and knowing members of my own community who identify as such, I want them to know that they are acknowledged, supported, and loved. For those of you trying to paint those who want to play Hogwarts Legacy with a broad brush of being transphobic though, I feel that idea is entirely unhelpful and actually counterproductive to raising awareness. Because as the evidence is beginning to show, it's creating a lot more enemies than it is creating allies. Many people out there who grew up during the time that I did probably don't have a whole lot of time and may not even be aware of the controversy. They've got to, raise their kids, go to work, pay the bills, and they just don't have the time to pay attention closely to the news. And they just want to relive their childhood dream. So instead of villainizing them, I think instead it's a good opportunity to raise awareness for causes that will actually make a difference, like donating to the Trevor Project, a nonprofit that serves to create resources and support struggling trans and non-binary people in addition to other LGBTQ lives. I'll provide a link down in the description below if you'd like to donate to them along with me. But whether or not you choose to buy Hogwarts Legacy is your decision, and I respect you if you choose not to buy it. For an entire generation, the magnificent design of Hogwarts has captured the hearts and minds of millions of fans around the world. Its grand silhouette, best viewed backlit by the light of the moon, standing atop a rocky bluff, partly surrounded by sparkling water, is a scene that has enchanted fans and become so famous that it's even become recognizable to those who have never even seen the films or read the books. However, what many of you might not know is that the design of Hogwarts actually changed throughout each and every movie of the series, modified to suit the story's requirements. When I was younger, I actually didn't even notice this, but looking back, it's pretty clear that this was happening. This was, as you imagine, one of the biggest challenges for the creators of Hogwarts Legacy, who had to satisfy the expectations of devout fans while simultaneously constructing fresh and exciting adventures for new ones. Luckily, as we'll soon see, they succeeded in bringing the beloved settings of the film to life, as well as to create brand new spaces that bind these familiar ones together in a truly enchanting way. So let's begin with the exterior of Hogwarts, and then we'll move our way on into the interior. Hogwarts' enchanting design is actually a unique blend of various architectural styles, with elements dating back to the English-Norman period of monastic and military castle designs of the 10th century. You can see this in the more squarish designs, which are reminiscent of the Norman-style structures that we know in the real world, like the Tower of London. And it's actually fitting that this style is present at Hogwarts, given that in lore, the school was founded in the 10th century, when this type of construction and fashion was prevalent for castles and lavish manor keeps that are in this style. What I find interesting, though, is that there has been a choice to make it castle-like, as it suggests that the Hogwarts original founders had defense in mind when they built it, or perhaps purchased it. It may have been a castle beforehand. The school's advantageous location atop a natural bluff, partially surrounded by water, providing natural defense, is also very supportive of this idea. In my view, then, I think that the designers here wanted to paint a narrative of how the founders may have sought to create a safe haven for young witches and wizards to study at. And if you look at the lore, it makes a lot of sense because during this time, they were hunted by normal muggle folk. As discussed in earlier episodes, narrative can be a powerful tool in creating successful design, and clearly, it was well employed here. Other styles also appear throughout the composition, which include early medieval monastic church type designs seen alongside some later medieval style rounded keeps and tower structures, a design that began to see more widespread use with the advancement of better siege cannons, which the round towers were more resistant to. Some towers even feature corbels, which may have at one time been matriculations or at least been inspired by them. It's a type of defensive structure that allows bowmen and crossbowmen to shoot down at enemies at the foot of walls. There's also even some classical keep and drawbridge designs if you look closely that you can see connecting the different parts of Hogwarts. One of the key design features of Hogwarts, though, that you're probably more familiar with are the Gothic styles, which gained popularity between the 12th and 16th centuries in both monastic and military architecture. Famous examples include the Louvre and Notre Dame Cathedral, both in France, and Oxford University, which was both the shooting location for much of the first film and inspiration to Rowling while writing the novels. During this period, castles became less military assets and more symbols of power due to improvements in canon design that made traditional castles, as we know them, pretty much obsolete. As a result, castles of this later period and manor homes built to resemble castles began to have larger windows and provide more comfort for occupants, since the structure's need to be defensive was rendered mostly unnecessary. There are some strange moments, though, in the design, such as the pinnacles on the sides of the Great Hall, which don't actually cap any structural flying buttresses as they probably should for this type of design. But we'll forgive them for this, it's supposed to be magical, not realistic. The eclectic mix of architectural styles seen at Hogwarts then paints an interesting picture of the history of the school's evolution, with buildings added, updated, and renovated over centuries to reflect the fashion and technology of their time. You may be surprised to learn then that this blend of building types is actually not uncommon in the real world. Castles that were continuously occupied by wealthy families would often be remodeled like this in order to incorporate the latest trends and innovations. The result of Hogwarts' historically inspired composition then is a charming mishmash of styles that tells a story behind the castle's long and varied past. Designing Hogwarts to have this kind of visual history that parallels our real world gives it a sense of authority, authenticity, history, and power, which is probably exactly what they were going for. Its size, though, gives us a sense of the magical nature of its purpose, as in some moments in the architecture become kind of whimsical, like the aqueduct bridge, which is more typical of the Roman period, or the intersecting cruciform church plan designs on top of the buildings, and this gigantic clock tower first seen in The Prisoner of Azkaban, and the iconic wooden Gothic bridge that leads to it. There are so many examples of this, but this just touches on what gives it a magical twist, which elevates it beyond the castle designs we're probably familiar with in our own real world. Ultimately, though, despite its tie to real-world designs, the layout of Hogwarts and its composition was the result of the desire to create a pleasing and immediately recognizable silhouette. There wasn't really an underlying logic to their organization. It really went by what looked good on screen, and that's fine. They made it logical later, and it just ended up kind of working, but we'll go into that when we actually get into the interior. Basically, for the people who made the films, they wanted to look good from some certain angles, and that's why it ended up changing in parts of the film. To be fair to the set design team, though, the filmmakers weren't required to make a sensible floor plan. After all, the spaces were never really ever going to be shown as a continuous shot. Some spaces from the film don't even actually match the exterior, like the square grand staircase being located in the central cylindrical tower. This is something that the Hogwarts Legacy team surely struggled to address, but unfortunately weren't able to completely solve in every case, as you'll find when we finally do the interior part of this video. Some of my favorite locations of the exterior include the main approach from the water, going up the grand winding exterior stair up to the main hall courtyard, the Hogwarts South Wing Clock Tower wooden bridge, the view from the viaduct, and of course the Transfiguration Courtyard. All famous locations from the film, who'd have thought? Really though, the whole place is amazing, and it's really difficult to choose from all of these what my favorite location is. There's so many great angles in this game. But now it's time to take a step on into the inside, where I'm going to show you some of my favorite locations because, well, I can't stress enough that Hogwarts is really, really, really big, and I couldn't show it in an entire video unless you wanted to watch one an hour long. So let's start with one of the most famous spaces that you guys probably know about. The very first room that you have seen in the Sorcerer's Stone nearly 22 years ago, the Great Hall. We'll get there by taking the same path that the characters in the original films did, by starting in the courtyard. Just like the films, you enter through a grand courtyard into a foyer stair. The space is absolutely nostalgic and immediately familiar despite being slightly different from the films that we're familiar with. The real-world shooting location actually only had one stair and not two seen here. We're also treated to some spectacular stained glass windows, pointed arch windows with the Gothic style, but with a magical twist if you look closely at the mullions. They're actually more tree-like instead of straight, which is not like what we would see in a real example. And the ceiling is also in the fan vault style, which was made famous by the Gloucester Cathedral, one of the places that was used to film the Harry Potter movies. Finally though, we arrive at the top of the landing in front of the famous large double doors where McGonagall stood to address the new students of Hogwarts. And if we step through them, we'll find ourselves in a familiar corridor, where to the left we'll find the 4 hourglasses representing the points of each house, which are accumulated throughout the year, and to the right the famous stair, but we'll go there in a moment. Traveling straight forward is the place we're going. That's the Great Hall. But unlike in the films, if you travel through those doors, you're not immediately put into the Great Hall. Instead, you find yourself in an antechamber, which I don't think was entirely necessary from an architectural standpoint, but it's not objectionable, so it's their choice. Finally, though, we arrive in the Great Hall. In the first films from which this takes inspiration, the room was directly inspired by Oxford University's Christ Church College Great Hall. The location wasn't ideal for shooting though, so they actually built the entire space at the Warner Brothers studios for the film. Familiar then are the wooden Gothic supports, the magical ceiling, the floating candles, and the 4 long tables representing the 4 school houses. I literally got chills walking into this room for the first time, and I'm guessing that some of you who have just seen this for the first time probably did too. However, there are some key differences in this design if you look closely from the films. Here there are now naves on the side, which are side passages, and they have broadly arched colonnades, which is strangely not in the Gothic style, so a little bit of an inconsistency with the interior design. But I'll forgive them for this because it still manages to look pretty cool. The location of the fireplace is also different from the movies. It's now on the left instead of the right. And finally, another major change is the faculty seating area, where the back wall is now rounded instead of straight and features 4 Gothic-style stained glass windows that feature pictures of the 4 different houses, which I think was a really nice touch. And it wasn't the only little touch that they added in here with the detailing. If we take a look at the sconces, they also feature the 4 houses now, where in the movies they were just eagles. I love this little attention to detail. It's just so cool. Many of these changes are tasteful instead of just being completely different than the movie, and that's the kind of change I'm happy to see. But now let's step back out into the corridor and visit another famous location from the films, the Grand Changing Staircase. Now this place is a bit different than you might remember. It's circular in plan design as opposed to square, which is actually now more accurate to the exterior of the building. The location is absolutely monumental and still achieves that sense of magic and wonder I think that was present in the films. This too is prominently in the Gothic style, with the bridges and pointed windows and even vaulted ceiling. Its unsupported size though, with relatively thin walls, make it feel a bit otherworldly. This space is impossible to build in the real world. It could only have been achieved by magic, which I think makes it a little bit more grand. One thing I now find humorous after, becoming an architect is just the concept of a moving stairway. The whole idea of a grand staircase is to create a central circulation path that's easily navigable and understood by users, but this does exactly the opposite. It tries to trick users, and I always found that kind of amusing. But I suppose it keeps you on your toes, doesn't it? I guess the architect had a rather strange sense of humor. Towards one of the upper landings in this space, we'll find ourselves though in the wing to the famous Gryffindor Common Room, which is our next stop. Down a sunbathed, wooden paneled Gothic-style corridor reminiscent of Oxford University, and behind a painting of a fat lady, you'll find the nostalgic Gryffindor Common Room and dormitories. That's if you know the right password. Like the Great Hall and Grand Staircase, the space in the game appears much larger than it did in the films, but still manages to capture the warmth and cozy feelings I associate with the room I grew up to love in the original movies. Just as in the films, the walls are adorned with rich scarlet tapestries and paintings of whimsical things. Instead of a stone floor though, there's a parquet-style wood pattern underneath the whimsically arranged ornate oriental rugs, atop which are assorted a number of comfortable-looking armchairs and accompanying tables that are grouped in varying scales of conversational spaces. The room then is pretty similar to the original film, just a lot bigger and maybe a little bit even more cozy. The room also wouldn't be complete without the massive crackling fireplace at the center. It still manages to feel like Christmas morning in here every time I step in. One interesting aspect of this interior though is that it's a little bit more castle-like than the other spaces that we've seen. Here the wall thicknesses are revealed through the deep window wells leading to early Gothic-style leaded glass windows. Just as on the exterior then, the Commons represents a changing nature of Hogwarts over the centuries. But there is still yet more to see, and if we step back out into the hallways, we'll finally arrive, if we wander enough, in Professor Weasley's classroom, located just off the Transfiguration courtyard near the heart of the school. I love the combination here of Gothic and college design styles with the wooden paneled walls, above which are repetitions of delicate Gothic lacework details, which lead to a wooden gabled ceiling supported by massive, beautifully carved wooden truss frames. The central recess floor also provides a wonderful location to give lectures that are engaging from a perspective and proximity to students that we're not used to in today's more basic classroom designs where the teacher lectures from the head of the room. The pointed Gothic arch-style windows with leaded glass near the rear are also wonderfully done. The classroom feels really true to form, much more than maybe some of the other spaces, with a very consistent styling around the entirety of the space. Next, then, back into the monastic-style Transfiguration courtyard, we can arrive at the Hogwarts Central Hall. I thought I'd highlight this space as it's one of the largest interior common spaces in the school, and it's also one that wasn't ever in the films. There was a comment made here by one of the characters earlier in the story that this is the school's Grand Central Station, which I thought was an interesting comment, because actually, according to the Game Zone timeline, which takes place in the late 1800s, Grand Central Station in New York wasn't built until 1904, which is around 20 years after the story, so this may have been a little bit of a mistake on the narrative part of the game's creation, but we'll forgive them for this. I understand that they were really inspired by that space, and it's pretty close, just not exactly correct. You might say that Antwerp Station was an inspiration, but that was also built in, I believe, 1889 or 8, so that would have been really pushing it. Maybe the space is more reminiscent of the Hagia Sophia, which is a lot older and probably more realistic. A space of this scale with the vaulted roof design like this could possibly have been done, but there are some construction problems here that probably wouldn't have been possible during that time period, such as the incredibly thin, unsupported, unbraced columns which would absolutely crumble under the immense load of this stone roof. But you can easily explain it away with magical reinforcements, which are clearly present in other parts of the structure, so why not here? And the resulting design is admittedly beautiful. I love this space, and that's why I'm including it as part of this video. But the next space I want to visit is actually directly attached to it, and it's under this wooden, kind of Gothic-style portico. This is the passage to the library. Now this space, if you paid close attention to the films, is actually quite different than in the movies, and there's a good reason for that. Like many of the other spaces in Hogwarts, the actual reality of the model that they built, the big physical one for the movies, was that the exterior was a lot bigger than the interiors that they had shown, because the real-world location, Duke Humphrey's Library at Oxford, which is what they used to film the library scenes, was actually quite a bit smaller than the model they created. So in order to address this, it seems that they had to change the architectural style just a little bit, which I think was really tasteful. Here, I think they took influence from Trinity College Library, which is a lot more appropriate for the scale of Hogwarts and still has a Gothic flair, which feels appropriate for the rest of the architecture. Personally, I don't mind the change because it still feels true to the films from certain locations, and if you didn't look for it, you probably would just feel it is the Hogwarts Library. So good job. Now, for the most part, the designers did a really good job of expanding and creating more details for a lot of spaces in Hogwarts that goes beyond what we saw in the films, but there are some places that fall short, and one of them I don't really like so much is the hallway that's meant to resemble the Cloister Halls of Gloucester Cathedral. Those are beautiful and iconic, and I can clearly see here that they were trying to mimic it, but didn't quite get there. I really wish they would have gone the full extra mile because some of the other places in the castle feel a lot better detailed than this, but it's really a minor thing and it's only something that I see because I know what they're trying to do and something that you probably won't realize if you're just playing through the game and are unaware of the influences. But now I want to take you to one of my favorite sections of Hogwarts, which has a lot of my favorite spaces, and that's the Dark Arts Tower, which is also now the Astronomy Tower. The lobby is incredibly detailed. I'm not quite sure what inspired this location from our real world, but it feels a bit Italian Renaissance with colors to me, and I really like the contrasting materials. But what I like even more is the cheeky way they did the structure, because although it appears on the surface to be sensible, there are some magical elements to it, specifically how the vaults end in these sort of hanging moments, which would be impossible to do with stone in the way that they've done it. It's clearly using magic or something to support it, which I think is perfect for the Hogwarts kind of whimsical feeling that they're trying to get. The vertical circulation stairways, both in the main area and on the sides, are also spectacular. I love the wooden paneled secondary stair tower. I absolutely love the color palette here and the super thin vertical windows on the intermediate landings. There were some strange decisions, though, that I think if I were in charge of this space, I would have had them change, and that's the way that they've done this super long vertical stained glass window. Generally speaking, stained glass windows are not meant to be interrupted by floor plates because they're meant to be appreciated on the interior of a building and not on the exterior, and there's no way for you to see this without going through multiple floors. It just feels a bit strange, and they should have done some sort of, reveal through the floor so you could see the whole thing, at least from a couple of angles. In the same space and just to the side, you'll also find the famous defense against the Dark Arts room, which appears pretty much identical to what you probably remember from the movies. The wooden Gothic curved roof supports a sense of being in a high attic space, but I would be lying if I didn't admit the nostalgia from the movies is really what's made me love this space so much. Up yet another set of stairs is one of my other favorite parts of the Dark Arts Tower. The space is rich with blue tapestries lining the corridor and capped at the end with an incredibly cozy looking conversational space. This is also how you gain access to Fig's office if you just cut to the right, which also resembles the Dark Arts classroom. It's just a little bit wider and taller. Yet even higher in the tower, though, we'll arrive at the coolest classroom I think in the entirety of Hogwarts, the Astronomy Classroom. I love the gold and rich blue color scheme here. It feels appropriate for the study of astronomy in its Gothic style, but with some very unusual contemporary stylings. And the wood flooring here is also really cool with the way that this inlay intersects with these depictions of constellations, and how one of the walls is also fantastically well made with this bookshelf that's made to resemble something astronomical. I'm not sure exactly what, but it looks really cool. And finally, the tower ends in the best view of Hogwarts and its surroundings, literally and figuratively capping off a short tour of my favorite spaces in Hogwarts. Overall then, the interior and exterior of Hogwarts in Hogwarts Legacy is incredibly impressive. It not only lived up to my expectations, but in many cases surpassed them with its masterful realization of the spaces in between that we've never seen on the big screen. And it's been also very faithful in recreating some of the best spaces from the films. Designers tackled a lot of big issues with this translation from film to video game, dealing with the scale and problems with the interior spaces from the movies in ways the films never could have due to their budgetary constraints, and just the laws of physics. I'm glad to see that they also weren't afraid to be a little bit more whimsical with some of these interior spaces. It didn't look to rely too much on real-world examples. I'd like to think that if magic did exist, It would enable some pretty incredible architecture, and Hogwarts, I think, does a great job of showing what that might look like. But what do you think? Did I miss something that you wish I would have talked about? What was your favorite space? And if I were to do another video on Hogwarts, what space would you want me to look at next? Let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, if you like this video and you want to see more, you know what to do.